Welcome to all of you. Glad you could be here. And this, I won't take up too much of your time because we're already running a little late. But I just wanted to say why we are trying to do this. This sort of came up as a discussion I was having with Piyush and Chavi, where we realized that there are so many of us, so many of you rather, who are working on the ground, working with people, trying to collect observations and do citizen science. But not all of us know each other. And we thought, at the very least, let's try to organize something where all of us can know what each other is doing. And hopefully that will lead to some interesting discussions and some synergies between what's happening. And as the plan progressed, we also thought we should try and be a little more ambitious. And since all of you are here, get you to think a little more about what you're doing and how you would like to take it forward and how all of us can work together. And that is really the motivation for us to be here. And without further ado, I'll ask Pankaj Seskaria. Pankaj is at IIT Bombay, and he will try and contextualize today's meeting for us.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Joy, and thanks to Piyush, Joy, and Chavi for the workshop and for inviting me. My name is Pankaj Seskaria. For a very long time, I have worked with Kalpavriksha in Pune, and the last 4-5 years, I've been teaching at IIT Bombay. The presentation that I want to make today, and the setting tone that Joy I didn't realize that I was supposed to set the tone, so I hope I set it right. But I'm going to try and be a little provocative and question the whole idea of citizen science and create that larger context for all of us to think through. And the idea of when we say citizen science, what do we really mean? And I think we all take it for granted. So the question at a very fundamental level, and it could perhaps be a little distracting or, like I said, provocative. What is science? Who is the scientist? Who is the citizen? So what happens when these two things come together? And there might be a concern that is this semantics, is have implication, but I think it goes deep down into what this whole thing means, because these are central to the idea of what citizen science is or can be. And I'm also coming to this from a slightly different vantage point, which is broadly work in the sociology of science and technology. So for a very long time, I've been interested in ecology, but over the last 10 years, I've also, my PhD work and the work that I do now is in what's broadly called the sociology of technology. So I am actually, I used to be a keen bird watcher. I'm not as interested in birds as I am interested in the birder. Who are these characters sitting here who do citizen science? Who are the people who are organizing citizen science projects? What are their motivations? What is the history and the context of this whole thing? So this is a larger question on science and technology. And when I finished my PhD, I tried to bring this together through a project I did to look at ecology, but also look at the social studies of science. And we had this project when I was at IIT Delhi for a year and a half as a senior project scientist with a colleague there who's also a faculty, Naveen Thayil. We kind of put together this project to study citizen science in India. So as much as you are interested in the bird, like I said, I'm interested in the person who does the birding and things like that. So this, we published a report, and then more recently we converted that into a little book called First Steps, and I brought copies if anybody of you are interested. So like we all authors will claim, it is the first study of its kind of citizen science in India. But we found out some very interesting things, and I will run you through some of what we found out, but also ask some critical questions of what it is. So typically, the most uncharitable characterization of citizen science is the conventional scientist getting free data. You're sitting here, I'm sitting in IIT Bombay, in IISER, IIC, we have this whole network of people who are giving you free data. There's nothing wrong with it. But we have to acknowledge the fact that that is also happening. And there are issues with that, but there are many layers of very interesting challenges that I'll put out. And there's a lot of work globally on citizen science on some of this. And the hope also is, of course, not to undervalue what's happening, but to critically look through some of these things, because we take many of these things for granted. So if I ask any of you or any of us what is citizen science, often we have not even thought about it, leave alone asking critical questions about that. And typically, how is citizen science different from, say, public science, from community science? We have a long tradition, say, in India in contemporary times, post-independence, of what is called community science, for instance. Is it the same thing? And is there a question about the fact that this is citizen science now and not community science? How did the community become the citizen? Are the methods the same? What role does technology play in facilitating this kind of activity? So these are some of the questions that I'd like to put out. We have answers to some of them. We don't have answers to most of them. But more importantly, I think these will be very interesting and useful questions to engage with. And I'll kind of take you through some of that. So this is this book that we did recently, and it kind of came from this study over 2 years that we did at IIT Bombay. So we started off, it's very interesting. So why do you want to study citizen science? Of course, and from the perspective that we were doing, we started this sometime in 2017. And it is amazing if you look at the available data at that point of time, how much explosion has been there in the so-called citizen science projects in the country in the last 4 years only. So when we started off in 2017, we did a not very, very scientific or very comprehensive, but on an average, if you looked at what was available about citizen science in the country, it was very limited. So up to July 20, middle of July, they were roughly across media through Google searches. You could find maybe one story a week that was appearing in the media about citizen science. So it seems to be, and one would need to more critically look at that, that might have been the cusp, might have been the moment where things started to kind of take off. Because after that, there is an absolute explosion. So if you just look at projects now that are called citizen science, I mean, there may be a few hundred projects in India, or maybe slightly less, but compared to when we started our study, projects that labeled themselves as citizen science were very few. And in this study that we did, we studied 17 citizen science projects. And some of you are aware there was a CITSI conference that's been happening over the last 2-3 years. I'm one of the members in the steering committee, and just a very preliminary website that we put up, we have about 30-40 projects that are listed on that as citizen science. So within 3-4 years, this is almost trebled in terms of what we have on that website, which is limited. And interestingly, projects that we were studying also don't exist. So they have stopped to be. So there is a whole sustainability thing comes into very, very interestingly. But you see, these are the kinds of things that we are seeing in middle of 2018 in the media. So for example, we use that. The story on the left-hand side is a lead story in the Hindustan Times in 2018. The Hindu carried a lead story in the Sunday magazine. So it was starting to get tremendous prominence at that point of time. So why is it relevant to study citizen science, particularly from the perspective that we were looking at? For 2 or 3 obvious reasons, that projects that call themselves citizen science, and I'm saying call themselves citizen science because self-identification is a very important criteria of selection. I mean, how do you decide what is citizen science? Are there well-established or accepted criteria of what can be included and cannot be included? So as a methodological tool or a trick, we went about only looking at those projects that identify themselves as citizen science. Why they do that, we don't know, but we are saying, okay, this is what they are saying, and we do that. So if you look at globally, there are thousands of projects across Europe, the US, Australia that have citizen science as their methodology and stuff like that. Now, in the other literature, in the public understanding of science, in ecological studies, in what's called science and technology studies, the field that I'm talking to you about, we see that citizen science as a theme, as a scientific endeavor, like a discipline in science, is beginning to emerge prominently in the narrative. So how does a discipline come to be? It's a very interesting study in sociology. When does a new kind of activity in science become a discipline in science? And there are 2 or 3 markers of that, which I'll kind of look to you. And also that it's a relatively new phenomenon, so it becomes interesting to study. And there are 2 main parts of the presentation. I'll engage with some literature globally and in India, and then also present to you some of the empirics of citizen science in ecology in India. And the interesting question that we've not been able to answer is whether there is an Indian citizen science, as it were, because some of the fundamental claims in this kind of study is that social context, cultural context matters. It influences scientific activity. So, and where citizen is so central, or is supposed to be so central, obviously there should be implications, because one can actually make a claim that even science inside the laboratory is influenced by socio-cultural context. So when we are looking at a field of science which is in the world out there, where people are interacting with each other and with the landscapes, can there be something that is interesting and unique? And there are interesting articulations that we got through the studies that we did. I don't know whether we can call that Indian citizen science, but sometimes counterintuitive narratives that go against the grain, as it were. So somebody said, we don't do citizen science, we do counter science. And what is this counter? I will come to you to later. So this, some of you may have seen or may already know. The Oxford University Dictionary defines citizen science as scientific work undertaken by members of the general public, often in collaboration with or under the direction of professional scientists and citizens and scientific institutions. Now, 2014 and this period is very interesting, that it seems to be that now this is part of the standard lexicon, as it were. It's entering the literature, entering formal structures of language and of definitions. And similarly, there is the citizen scientist who's defined as scientists whose work is characterized by a sense of responsibility to serve the best interests of the wider community, now rare, and a member of the general public who engages in scientific work, often in collaboration with or under the direction of professional scientists. This is our justification of why we want to do, because there's a growing awareness of the public in matters of the environment. So one of the very interesting normative claims about citizen science is that citizens will then contribute to understanding and working on their environment and environmental issues better. And there, from a very technical and a scientific perspective, I have a question as to whether intervention is that NGO activism, and where do you draw the line between science, research, and intervention? And I'm not saying that these are very easy lines to draw, but we often conflate activism with citizen science. Or creating awareness is very important. I mean, I'm not saying no, but is creating awareness the same citizen science as citizen science of another kind? And is it an important question at all? That's a question also to ask. But these are important things that we have to keep in mind. There's a growing availability of big data, which is very central, both in terms of what citizen science offers, but also how you do citizen science. And there is the larger interest of participation of the citizenry in. Now, from a slightly technical perspective, this is the Handbook of Science and Technology Studies, the sociology of science kind of work, and the area that I work in. And we saw something very interesting. There were two handbooks, one in 2008 and 2017. So like an omnibus 2000-page collection that gives you a sense of the field. And what you find in 10 years is, if you look at the entries on citizen science in this work, there's only one entry in 2008. And in 2017, there's a whole bunch of entries that are entering the literature on this particular field. So you see democratization of science, documentation from citizen science, effectiveness, emergence, environmental problems, urban design. So we are at an interesting moment in the late post 2015, where this is beginning to happen. Now, this is very interesting if you look at how the articulation of citizen science happens. And when you study science and technology in these ways, I think these questions become important. And I think I'm going to shoot time, so I'm going to run through quickly. But this is the two articles I mentioned, Behrawala in 2018 in the Hindustan Times and Perincherry 2018 in the Hindu. These are huge front page articles on the Sunday magazines, a prominent reading. Now, I'll just underline some things. So what are you saying about citizen scientists? They don't have PhDs. If you look at, but citizen scientists are helping actual scientists. So citizen scientist is not an actual scientist. So you're making a very clear demarcation of who is the scientist, who's the real scientist, who is not the real scientist. For researchers, citizen scientists are a boon. So who is this researcher? It's probably an IISER scientist or an IIT professor or an IISc researcher. So what I'm trying to point to you over here is there is a subliminal or a intuitive understanding that these two things are different. Now, is it important? How is it important? We can discuss. But the fact that there's a clear differentiation being made between a citizen scientist, a so-called citizen scientist, and a so-called actual scientist. So the question goes back to what I asked in the very beginning. Who is a citizen? What is science? Who is a scientist? What does it mean to do science? And these questions become very central. Now, this is just a quick background of history. Bonney et al. Writing in the Public Understanding of Science in their paper. So Alan Irwin's book in 1995 is the first book that actually articulates citizen science as a term. And here actually Irwin's work is mainly about democratization of science. So the argument that science is too hegemonic, it is too captured by the institutions, and citizen science is one way of breaking that hegemony. And in the narrative on citizen science, this is a very important articulation that happens across the board. So even a lot of the scientists we spoke to have a tremendous normative idea that science has to break out of the shackles, that people have to contribute, that people can contribute, that science has to be democratized, and that citizens can do it. But Irwin's articulation is centrally that. But if you look at what might be considered citizen science method, they have been there forever. If you go back into history, and there's a lot of documentation, these are some very prominent examples of this century, the 20th century. The Christmas bird count in the US, the US Fish and Wildlife Service's breeding bird survey, the Cornell Nest Record Card program for birds. In India, the Asian water bird census. Some of you may have participated in that. And it's actually absolutely fascinating to look at the narratives of Rahmani, for example, Asad Rahmani, on why that project did not succeed in the way that it did, or that it did not. And there seems to be a clear differentiation where technologies were not possible. So what it actually was doing in the 80s was much more than what many citizen science projects are doing today. But it could not come together. And there's an interesting kind of break that happens. If you look at other work, they give evidence of history. Winemakers in France who have been recording grape harvest for more than 40 years. Court diarists in Kyoto, Japan, recording dates of the traditional cherry blossom festival for 1200 years. Citizens and officials in China tracking outbursts of outbreaks of locusts for 3000 years. So citizen science is not new. I mean, if depending on how we define it. So who is getting that data and who is holding that data, I think then becomes very interesting and important. Now, so I will kind of move ahead from here. What's interesting, like I mentioned, in the 2014-2015 is also where internationally the community of citizen science seems to be coming together. So in the social studies of science, one finds that there are two very interesting markers of an evolving of a discipline. One is the creation of a journal around your field of work, and the other is the creation of associations of people who are doing this kind of science. So in 2015, we see across the globe, whether it's in the US, whether it's in Europe or in Australia, you see these associations of citizen scientists coming together. And maybe this is the moment in India where this is happening. 5 or 6 years later, of course, driven from what's happening in the West, which is what is true of most science in India. So we might be saying the 22, 23, 21 might be the moment when gatherings of this kind are happening. I mean, this workshop is a classical example where everybody has come together under the label of citizen science. So maybe it is taking a shape, and 20 years from now or 10 years from now, we might be able to say, and if you go back and see in these years, how many workshops happened, how many of them were the first type, and you might see an evolution or the creation of a community of citizen scientists, as it were. It could be, it could not be, but we are at a moment where we are able to actually see it and track it happening. So there are typologies of citizen science. So there are different kinds of citizen science. There's a lot of very interesting work globally. We used two typologies in our work, and I'll just give you those two quickly examples. One is data collection, which I think is pretty much the broad understanding of citizen science. I think it's very instrumental. And of course, particularly in ecology and most other fields, the temporal and spatial scales that allows you to, that demands collection of data from large sources of people or makes it possible is very, very clear. But here it's basically, again, I go back to that most uncharitable characterization of free data from people you will, where you never access. There is the whole category of data processing. They articulate a category of curriculum-based citizen science, which is very interesting. So I think in the Indian context, I would say Season Watch is perhaps one citizen science project that is very centered on education. And there might be others. I could be, I'm looking at the CE people and I'm wondering maybe they're going to jump at me and say, no, we do that too. And probably you do. Yeah, well, that's really, hurry up. I'll hurry up. But what they're saying is that depending on what you want to do your citizen science for, you'll have to plan for that accordingly. Otherwise, awareness generation, education ends up being a collateral benefit that emerges from a citizen science project. But they say if you look at citizen science projects that have education very centrally embedded in their idea, then the way they construct their program is very different. And that's actually very, very interesting. So citizen science has to be, or people are saying they're thinking through what they're doing, and that kind of gives us a good idea of what is possible and what more is possible if it's structured in a particular way. And then there is community science. So Wiggins and Croston have a similar typology, which overlaps. They have a different set of terms, but it overlaps with the categories of Bonney in different ways. Okay, so I'm coming to what we did. We studied 17 projects. We looked at multiple sources, newspaper coverage, peer-reviewed articles, data on respective websites. We tabulated the information into data sheets of roughly 45 fields. All of this is there in the book that I mentioned if you would like to have a look. So this is what we kind of did. This is the initial one. So you have the project, you have the Village Wildlife Volunteer, Bird Count India, Frog Watch. In Lakshadweep, the Dakshin was doing a project, and the India Biodiversity Portal, which is like an aggregating large platform which gathers information. So you have at various scales, you have aggregating platforms, you have national level bird surveys, and then you have geography specific or location specific projects of butterflies or spiders or things like that. And then we kind of tried to put together just some overarching stuff of what it was. So what is the purpose of the project? We tried to find out what was the genesis of the idea. Some people say, that I was very fed up with how science was working. Some people say we realized that only citizens can contribute, etc., etc. So it's very interesting how these stories emerge and how they come and then eventually merge, so to say. And then what are the promises, threats of citizen science, which all of you know? So what are the key findings? There's a growing interest in the use and methods of citizen science. It seems to be about a decade old. We're talking of 2017, so maybe 2005 or something it's beginning. We estimate there are 25-30 citizen science projects in ecology. I'm talking of 2017, 2018. And what's interesting is majority of the projects are being initiated by trained scientists and ecologists. So the question that we asked is, does the scientist need the citizen in citizen science, or does the citizen need the scientist? So it's basically the scientist conveniently using, and I'm sorry, I mean, many of you may not like what I'm saying, is using the citizen, is mobilizing the citizen. Now, number of scientists contributing the projects varies considerably depending on many things. It ranges from a few hundred, sometimes even less. All of you would know that. In many projects, to about 12,000 in eBird, in bird count. They have the largest contributing set of people. Now, if 12,000 people can contribute so much data, and I think eBird contributes the third highest set of data in the global eBird project. Imagine if 12,000 people are contributing in a country like this. Imagine the scale that is possible. Imagine what can actually be delivered. And that is the possibility of citizen science. I mean, there's no doubt about that. If you just double these numbers, you can imagine how much data would actually be gathered. A majority of the projects are the data contributing projects. And the volume also varies from a few thousand data points in some projects to 10 million in the case of the most popular, which is eBird, and that's already 5 years old. So it may be already 20, 30, 40% more than this. A majority of the projects are family or species based, but there are also those for mapping environmental parameters like beach profiling in one case, and others that map certain events, road kills in forest areas. And another prominent category, of course, is the omnibus data aggregating platforms like India Biodiversity Portal or the one that is out of the NCBS, which is, I forget the name now, which Krishna Kunte runs. Now, central to the increasing popularity, we realize, is a set of modern technologies. That's very, very crucial and interesting. It is a certain configuration of modern technologies, smartphones, range of apps, the internet, Google Map, for instance. So this would not have been possible in the way it has been possible if a certain configuration of technologies had not come through. And again, all of you are practicing citizen scientists or coordinators, and I'll just give me one extra minute, Joy. So you will know that what is the range of technologies that you're able to use and how that is important. Questions that came up, again, many of you must be facing this: financial sustainability, sustaining and increasing citizen participation, because not only do you have to recruit people who drop out, because many people drop out from these projects, you have to increase your numbers. What is the quality of data? That could be asked of conventional science also. We unfortunately don't ask enough of that question, but we always ask a question of citizen science, which is partly true and partly problematic. Who owns the data? Very important question that have not been asked. So for instance, if on a citizen science project, a citizen scientist who's voluntarily contributing ends up in an accident or violates the law, whose responsibility is it? very important things to think about, because can the citizen science project disown responsibility because I was actually violating law to collect data to provide to your project? So what happens in those kinds of situations? Very interesting questions on the normative side of voluntarity. So one of the key definitions of citizen science is people contribute voluntarily. So what does voluntarity mean? So giving somebody, inviting somebody to contribute with the promise of authorship, or with the promise of a t-shirt, or a badge, is that then, does it become, or does it remain voluntary anymore? You are giving some incentive, it may not be financial incentive. So the central idea of voluntarity, which again many of you perhaps think about it, or certainly everybody says that, I think needs to be questioned, needs to be unpacked. The citizen science nomenclature, like I said, where is it coming from? Why are we using citizen science and not community science or public science? And the whole question of democratization of science. So I'll just come to this last question and finish here. Class issues. This was a very interesting thing that emerged in certain articulations in our project. Who can contribute to a citizen science project? So only that person who on a Sunday morning has the leisure time to sit in the balcony over a cup of coffee, have the money to buy a binocular perhaps, will sit and watch birds and contribute. So where somebody, and there is no interest, there has to be a disinterestedness. You're not interested in the resource. But what happens to a fisherman who is actually interested in the resource because his or her livelihood is dependent on that? What happens to their contribution, and how can their contribution be taken in? So, these are very interesting questions of that we need to consider, and if we do, I think it will be very interesting and valuable. And I can talk a little bit more about that, and I will, yeah, that's it. This is the book. And I mean, this is Citizen Science India, and you can see already many of the projects that we studied in our project are not there anymore, are not in this database. So it's an amazingly expanding field. Very interesting innovations are happening. But for instance, and I'll finish by saying this one project in on the coast of Tamil Nadu, a set of NGOs started a citizen science project with a very clear articulation of creating a new narrative of science. Because what they were saying is that the state is coming and taking over our resources based on a certain narrative of this place, which is not true. And we will create our own counter science. We will use citizens, and we will create a narrative of this place that will counter the narrative of the state. Is that possible? Will we allow that to happen? I think that is the real potential, if you ask me, of citizen science. The same thing happened in the Lakshadweep project, where they are saying that the fisheries department is saying there's a lot of fish to fish. Fishermen are saying there's nothing left here. Nobody is willing to believe them. So how do you create a science that will challenge that narrative? And that is perhaps the largest potential there. Otherwise, of course, the data and understanding will continue, and it should continue. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much. My apologies for taking extra time.